Have you ever had a fight over the thermostat in your home? Maybe one person is too warm while the other person is putting on a sweater because they're freezing? Or maybe you've just had a day where you couldn't figure out if you were too hot or too cold, but you just felt uncomfortable? If any of that sounds familiar, then you've already dealt with the concept and controversy behind the topic of today's video, thermal comfort. Thermal comfort is, well, it's hard to say exactly because the whole point of it is that once you've reached it, you don't have to think about it anymore.
I can't tell where the air ends and my skin begins. It's incredible.
But despite what we might have learned from network TV, thermal comfort isn't just an HVAC issue. In fact, the more we tried to pin this down, the more we realized it isn't just a building science issue at all. That's right, today on ShineTV, we are going to be breaking out of the thermal envelope and into the lab. So join us as we take a quick hiatus from building science and start doing some science! Before we can even begin to talk about comfort, we first have to take a look at that first word, thermal. As you might be able to guess by looking at it, thermal relates to heat. That's why you might use a thermometer to take the temperature of the coffee in your thermos. Sounds simple, right? If we're unhappy with the amount of heat in the house, we just go over, turn up the thermostat, the air temperature rises, and we're comfortable again. So I guess we're done here, right? Well, not always. If you turn up the thermostat when the air temperature isn't the issue, then you might just be spending more money to be just as uncomfortable. You see, we don't just detect thermal comfort through the temperature of the air. And this is something you probably know even if you haven't really thought about it. For instance, if you've ever sought out the shade on a sunny day to get out of the heat, then you acted on it already. So we need to go deeper. We need to ask, what is heat exactly? Heat is a form of energy. Specifically, it's the kinetic or movement energy of molecules. Molecules, like these water molecules, are always vibrating. They naturally want to sit right next to each other. But the more kinetic energy they get, the more they vibrate. And the more they vibrate, whoa, the hotter they get! But energy is never static, meaning that it never stays in one place, and neither is heat. As soon as molecules have heat, they start to give it away. But that's good, because if heat didn't move, we'd never really experience it. Now we're getting somewhere. Let's look into the 3 ways that energy can be transferred, beginning with radiation is the direct emission of heat, and it's the most difficult mode of heat transfer to control for if it's not properly planned for before a home is built. The simplest way to think about this kind of transfer is that it works like light. In fact, when heat is traveling through radiation, it's just on a slightly different wavelength than what we experience as visible light. Both light and heat travel in direct lines and waves until they collide with some kind of object. In the case of light, that impact creates illumination. In the case of heat, it creates warmth. Although we've largely moved away from it as a modern heating strategy, radiation was our original means of controlling thermal comfort. And if you've ever sat around a campfire for warmth on a brisk night, then you know both about its effectiveness and its limitations. For example, you probably noticed that while one side of you was getting toasty, the other side was still pretty cold. That's because radiation only moves in direct lines, and so it can't really grant total body comfort. Radiation is also the only form of heat transfer that doesn't require matter, and thank goodness for that. After all, the source of most of the heat and nearly all the energy on our planet is the sun, and the sun's heat has to travel millions of miles through the vacuum of space before it can reach us. Once it's here, the sun's radiation gets absorbed by the air or by the earth, or photosynthesized by plants into all the energy that we use on the planet. Think about it. All the fuels that we burn begin as sunlight, transformed into carbon molecules by plants, then by thousands and millions of years of fossilization into coal, oil, and gas. In our homes, we experience radiation in a few ways. The most obvious is through our windows, where solar radiation gets transformed into stun rays for house cats. But if you're like any of the families in my hometown where we had to store up firewood for winter or else had to break out a space heater in January, then you've experienced the power of radiation as well. But not all forms of radiation in a home are intentional or even desired. What we're using today are extremely efficient LEDs, but good old-fashioned incandescent light bulbs actually lose more energy as waste heat than they use to produce light. That means if you've got any of these in your house, then you're losing money 2 times over in the summer. First time from the inefficiency of the light, and the second time to remove all that waste heat from your house. It's not just hot things that radiate heat. Cold things like ice cube also radiate heat. They just have so much less heat that they do so much more slowly. You can think of it a bit like this. All matter, just like the center of this globe, is constantly emitting heat in all directions. But that heat is diffuse and gradual. But we could ramp up the intensity if we wanted to, with just a little touch. Conduction is the key to our primary method for controlling thermal comfort in our homes. Conduction is the direct transfer of heat through contact. If you've ever accidentally touched a hot stove or pan, then you've experienced a very painful form of conduction. You might have experienced a little bit of the radiant heat as your hand got close, but there wasn't enough to cause actual pain. That is, until you actually touched it, and then the heat had a direct pathway to flow into you. And in the opposite direction, the feeling in your hand when you make a snowball or touch an ice cube is also conduction. Heat travels out of your hand and into the ice cube, making your hand feel cold and making the ice cube melt. But wait a minute, we aren't walking around our homes with hot irons or ice cubes to keep ourselves comfortable. How can conduction be responsible for our primary means of thermal comfort? Well, conduction doesn't just work on solids. Come into contact with a cold gas and yeah, that's still conduction. You'll still feel cold. As we've talked about in our previous videos, the way HVAC systems work is usually by conditioning the air, getting it the right temperature, and then blowing it throughout the home. That way, once we come into contact with the air, it feels the way we want it to. It conducts the right amount of heat into our bodies. Conduction is also the primary way that heat moves through our walls. The sun's radiant heat hits the outside of our walls, and then it conducts through the wall system and comes into our house. The materials that we use to build our walls, wood, metal, stone, brick, all tend to be very good conductors. They allow the transfer of heat through them easily. Fortunately, not all materials are good conductors. Things that are insulators prevent the flow of energy. These gloves, for example, are a form of insulator. In other words, they resist the flow of heat. In our homes, we fill our walls with insulation to stop the sun's radiant heat from getting in directly and ruining our thermal comfort. So that's conduction. A hot object in contact with a cold object, transferring its heat to it. But here's an interesting thing. Heat doesn't just make objects hotter. Sometimes heat can actually make matter move all by itself. It's a very groovy phenomenon called convection. Is probably the mode of heat transfer that I've spent the most amount of my time trying to combat. Convection is the cycle of heat transference that happens when heat itself causes matter to move. Kinda trippy, right? Fortunately, solids don't undergo convection, but heat up a gas or a liquid, and something interesting happens. Remember back when we were talking about radiation, and we said that incandescent lamps actually generate more waste heat than they do light? Here we can see that in action. The waste heat from the lamp comes up into the wax, making its molecules begin to vibrate. And when they vibrate, they begin to expand. And when they expand, they become less dense. And when they become less dense, they become proportionally lighter. Think of filling a balloon with helium. As the balloon gets bigger, it becomes lighter than the air around it, making it float. The less helium it has, the less it can float. The same thing happens with the wax in our lava lamps, just in slower motion. It expands, becomes lighter, and rises. As the lava rises, it begins giving off all the heat to the cooler liquid around it. As it does, its molecules slow down, contract, and become heavy. Convection is also the motor behind the air leaks in your house. If you have any air leaks, convection will drive the hot air up through your ceiling and into your attic, and will also propel cold air down through your bottom plates and into your basement. As we've said before, as home energy raters, we inspect a lot of homes and look for a lot of air leaks. Sometimes the builder will take care of them on their own. Sometimes we actually get contracted to address the air leaks as we find them. But I can't tell you how many air leaks I have found in homes that have gone completely ignored because the builder didn't think they were important. You know, I bet the people who wound up living in those homes would have disagreed. Understanding radiation, conduction, and convection is crucial to creating livable spaces. And it's important that we come up with strategies not just to combat these individually, but the ways that they can work together to create new problems. Next time, we're going to talk about the ways that these can synergize and cause new problems for us, and the way that our science smarts can help us break those synergies apart. We're really excited to get back to the buildings after this fun hiatus, so until next time, make sure to click like, subscribe, leave us a comment if there's another topic you'd like us to cover on another video, and until then, shine on. Girls in it begin to, nope, that's not, none of that is correct. All right, just absolutely none of it.
This is all wrong, folks.
This is all wrong.